Hello everyone, this is Serious Trivia. Welcome back to our last episode of Let's Talk Lore, covering the military ranks and titles. This is episode 4, where we'll talk about Tier 5 and Tier 6, the final two tiers of the military ranking structure, as well as how the Han army structure was set up for the normal troops. So first off, we have Tier 5 and Tier 6, or 五品, or 六品, and there's 4 main categories. So first you have 偏将军, which are basically vice generals. They tend to be second in command on the battlefield. You usually have a couple of these that go with the main general in charge of the army. And then you have someone who's even lower than that I'm calling assistant to the general, and that is 批将军. And basically these two assist the main general in the dealings with the army. And then you have a huge list of 杂号将军, or miscellaneous name generals that belong to Tier 5. And finally, in Tier 6, they are what's called 护军, or what I'm going to call military human resources. 护军are usually the generals that's in charge of recruiting. They recruit troops, they recruit other generals, other lieutenants. Basically, they're in charge of the human resource structure for the army. So, quickly looking through the miscellaneous name generals, we have a ton in Tier 5. This is where most of these generals exist. And we're not going to talk about every single one of them. We have a list of over 30, and within each 10 set, we're just going to cover one of them. So first we have 阴阳将军, or the eagle's wing, 折冲将军, or the general who subdues the enemy, 虎烈将军, tiger's rage, 宣威将军, heralding might, 威远将军, the general who projects might to faraway lands, 宁远将军, the general who calms faraway lands, and 伏波将军, the general who's calming the waves. 虎威将军, tiger's might. 临江将军, this is actually a location, so it's actually just 临江. 荡寇将军, the general who sweeps through the bandits. 昭武将军, the general who favors martial. 赵烈将军, the general who favors rage. And of these, I just picked out 伏波将军, who is 夏侯惇. Now, 伏波 has quite a big history. It doesn't actually mean the general is literally calming the wave. This title was first given to an earlier general in the Han Dynasty called Ma Yuan. Now, he showed up briefly in our latest Nanman series when Zhuge Liang went into a shrine that was dedicated for Ma Yuan. And Ma Yuan was a general who fought all over the fringes, north, west, south of the Han Empire, and helped calm a lot of crisis, which is compared to the crashing of waves. So the title of calming the wave was kind of given out to him, and it shows his personal abilities to take care of any crisis, no matter where in the kingdom. And Cao Cao gave this title again to Xiahou Dun in the Three Kingdoms period to kind of reflect that Xiahou Dun served the same purpose for him as Ma Yuan did for the Han Empire early on. So that's this group. Moving on, we have 12 more here. We have Zhao De Jiangjun, the general who favors honor. Tao Ni Jiangjun, the general who attacks the rebels. 破虏将军, the general who broke the prisoners. 讨寇将军, the general who attacked the bandits. 宣德将军, the general who heralds honor. 威鲁将军, the general who projects might to prisoners. 俘虏将军, the general who captures the prisoners. 真吴将军, the general who eliminates Wu. 真夷将军, the general who eliminates the eastern nomads. 杨烈将军, the general who spreads rage. 建中将军, the general who builds loyalty. And 利益将军, the general who stands for loyalty. So from this group, I picked 讨逆将军, Sun Ce. Now, Sun Ce got this title when Yuan Shu declared himself as emperor, and Sun Ce split himself from Yuan Shu and claimed the south and started attacking Yuan Shu, who was the collective rebel during the time, as he was the only warlord to create a kingdom while the Han government was still kind of in existence. So Sun Ce was gifted this title as he was now attacking this rebel force. And lastly, we have 10 more here. We have Huaiji Jiangjun, the general who remembers the coalition. Hengye Jiangjun, the general who crosses the field. Lou Chuan Jiangjun, the general of the tower ships. Fu Tu Jiangjun, the general who restores land. Zhongyi Jiangjun, the general of loyalty. Jianjie Jiangjun, the general who builds faithfulness. Yi Wei Jiangjun, the general of the winged guards. Tao Yi Jiangjun, the general who attacks the eastern nomad. Huaiyuan Jiangjun, the general who remembers faraway land. And Huanbian Jiangjun, the general who assists the fringes. And from these, I picked Hengye Jiangjun, or the general who crosses the field. And this title was given to Xu Huang after the loss at Chibi, when Cao Cao was redeploying his men to defend the northern parts of the Jin province, as the armies of Sun Quan and Liu Bei was fighting to reclaim most of the Jin province. So these are just some of the generals that's given out during this time period. This is probably the majority chunk of these miscellaneous named generals, and most of these are just tier 5. And as you can tell, some of these have a little bit more history when they were first created, and they were just reused during this period, and others were just newly created titles during this period for a fitting general making a certain move or event where it granted them such titles. So this here concludes all the tiers and ranks that we have for generals during this time period in the late Eastern Han Dynasty into the Three Kingdoms period. And some of these general titles stayed all the way through the Jin Dynasty and even into the Sui and Tang Dynasty, where you see many of the same names used in later generations. Now, we're going to shift our focus away from the generals and talk about normal troops and how the Han army structure actually worked. So the basic unit of a Han army is something called Wu. Now, Wu simply means 5, and it's a little different character for 5. This character can be split left and right. The left side is kind of an accent mark that stands for people, and the right side of the character just reads 5. So this literally means 5 people. Most of the characters in Chinese language are pictograms, so this one kind of depicts that. You have 5 and people put together, and it means 5 people. And this is the base unit of the army. And usually how it worked is when you are living in a village. Now, most armies are not professional armies. They were conscripted. So it's based on the village you're in. And each unit of 5 households is made into a wu. And when war comes and there is a draft, someone will go to your village, one of the recruiters, and every unit of 5, each household have to contribute 1 man. Now, sometimes that's not possible. Maybe the men are all gone already and there's only women left in this household, or maybe the men that's in the household is either too young, too old, or already injured where they can no longer fight. In that case, you will still have a wu, but it just wouldn't be a full unit of 5 men. And these households are assigned to the village when the land is distributed to the farmers. And then when you have 2 units of wu, you form a shi. Now similarly, this character is also the human kind of character and the 10 characters squished together, very similar to the wu. And this is simply 2 units of 5 making 10 men, and this is another common unit in the army. And then what happens around the whole village is that you have sets of 5 units of shi, and 5 times 10 is 50 men, and this kind of represented a whole village. And even today, in some parts of northern China, the term 屯子, which comes from 屯 here, means a village. And the term 屯田, or the policy of having soldiers farm during peaceful time and fight during wartime, also is reflected in this term. Basically, 屯 means a village, and 田 means farmland. So 屯田 is a policy of letting the village farm, and during wartime, you can draft a 屯 from such village. And that's a very common unit. A 屯 is a very standard size unit. And once again, even though it says 50 men here, often you're not going to get the full 50 when you're drafting from a village. So you try to get as many as you can. It simply represents 50 households in such village. And then moving up, you can gather 10 such villages, or 10 屯, and together you have what's called a qu. And qu is 500 men. And this is pretty much the size of like a battalion during the time period. And finally, you have another unit that's 1,000 men and simply 2 qu called a bu. And bu is usually commanded by a lieutenant. So a xiao wei that we mentioned earlier usually commands a bu. And depending on the general in charge and the kind of battle you're going to go fight, you can have multiple bu inside your forces. Now, many of the army figures we see in Three Kingdoms is over-exaggerated in the Romance version, because if you consider during the peak of the Han Dynasty, in the early stages, when war was still very commonplace, you had maybe up to 700,000 men in the fighting force, but it was probably closer to 500,000, and that was the peak during the height of the Han Dynasty. In the later stages, the standing army size is usually around 300,000. So you're really not going to see huge numbers as you see during the Three Kingdoms period, at least not portrayed in the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, where, Battle of Trebi is like Cao Cao brought 1,000,000 men. There's just not going to be 1,000,000 able-bodied fighting men during the period. And the figure is probably better if you divide it by at least 5, maybe even 7, to get a more historical look at the sizes. And you can kind of tell from the way these structures are set up. Now, during Three Kingdoms period, some of this structure obviously didn't matter as much to a lot of the warlords. You're not really just going to recruit 50 men from a village. So sometimes these numbers ballooned quite a bit as a lot of able-bodied men were drafted, and they were still called a twin, even though they might have 250 men instead of 50 men. But a general idea of what the standard structure is kind of presented here. So kind of want to share this at the end. And we're going to be ending our military ranks and title lore series and moving on to more narrative ones. I want to do Sun Jian's story next. So hopefully we get that started next week, and hope you enjoyed all of these series so far, and we'll see you next time. Bye!